Okay, chapter 8, which is human population. This is going to be the only chapter in our unit 3. So the case study at the start is about China's originally one-child policy that was started in 1979 because their population was growing out of control. Recently, in 2015, they did change it to become a two-child policy now. And originally, the one-child policy was enforced by rewards and punishments. So if you only had one child, that child was allowed to go to a good school. They got government benefits like health insurance and things like that. If you had a second child, that child was punished by not being allowed to go to the good schools and things like that. So it was a pretty, at the time, it was considered, it was decried by like everybody in the world in terms of a human rights standpoint, but it worked. We're going to turn the page here and see what some of the benefits and drawbacks were. On the positive side, because they did this, they were able to feed everybody. If they had allowed the population to grow unchecked, a lot of people might have starved to death. There's been less environmental damage because the population has not gone up as high, and they haven't had to, deforest things or build power plants or all of these sorts of things. And they've had enough jobs for everybody. So those are the pluses. On the negative side, though, in China, there is a cultural preference for male children. And because of that, a lot of people were selectively aborting female fetuses. And then if you lived in a rural area and you didn't have access to abortion, then a lot of them just abandoned their female children or send them to orphanages, because if you didn't, if you got rid of that female child, you could try again to have a male. Because of this, there are many more males than females in China, and this causes a lot of demographic problems in terms of violence and gangs and things like that. And now there is not enough young people to take care of the old people in terms of like a social security kind of program. So there's a lot to unpack in this case study. Then when we start here in section 8.1, you need to know this figure and caption. The human population is growing rapidly. This shows that we are experiencing exponential growth, that J curve that we learned about last unit. If you look right here, that little dip, that is from the Black Death in the 1300s. So it actually made a noticeable dip in the population curves. And then here, this sort of exponential growth has really taken off somewhere around 1800, and that's from the Industrial Revolution. You should know this estimating tool here. The U.S. population is the world population is currently growing around 1.2% annual growth rate, which doesn't sound like that much. But if you take this kind of rule of thumb, you take 70 and divide by the growth rate, and it will tell you how frequently it doubles. So 70 divided by 1.2 is about 58 years. So if we have unchecked growth, then our population would double in 58 years. You should also know this chart about where the highest population growth is occurring. It is mostly here, and you need to say in sub-Saharan Africa. They ask this a lot on the AP exam. You don't say Africa because South Africa and up in the north, like in Morocco and Egypt, they don't have quite the high population growth that they have here in sub-Saharan. And they say sub because they mean it is south of the Sahara Desert. And so that's where the highest population growth is occurring right now. If we turn the page to 190, you should know these two people that are talked about right here, Thomas Malthus and Paul Ehrlich. Malthus was actually in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and wrote a book about population and said, even back then, that if society did not reduce its birth rate, that we would overpopulate the planet. And then Paul Ehrlich did a similar thing in 1968 in a book called The Population Bomb. So you should know about those two guys. Here, this equation is called the IPAT model, and it's not really an equation in like a physics or chemistry sort of way, but it's really more of a relational idea. And it stands for I is influence, P is population, A is affluence, and T is technology. So what this is saying is that the impact of a population on the environment Depends on how large the population is, how affluent or how wealthy it is, and how much technology they use. The U.S. has a very high IPAT. Our impact is very large. We are the third most populous country in the world. We have a high degree of wealth and we use a lot of technology. So our impact on the environment is quite high. And then if we move, there's another science behind the story here that's kind of interesting, but you could skip it. And then on page 194, when we start getting into the idea of demography, you need to know what the top 5 most populous nations are in the world. China is number 1, India is number 2, the U.S. is number 3, Indonesia is 4, and Brazil is 5. And then it kind of gives you a breakdown of the next, I think the top 10 there. And so this is what the study of demography is. It takes into account population size, density, and distribution. You need to know that Southeast Asia has the highest population density. And this is because it's highest in like temperate, subtropical, and tropical climates. And so that area tends to have that's where a lot of that is found. And so you need to make sure though that you say Southeast Asia, because like up in the northern part of Asia, Mongolia, places like that, it's not very dense population at all. But this is like India, South China, Thailand, Vietnam, places like that. So that's where the highest population density is. And that means how close together the people are. Then on this page, these charts we're going to work with a lot. You need to understand them. They are called age pyramids or age structure diagrams. There's 3 types. There's this shape, and this shape. This shape right here, where the base is very wide, means that the population will increase rapidly. Over here, where they're kind of like the same all the way, that means the population is stable. And if it is wider at the top and has a smaller base, then that means the population will be decreasing. You need to know what these colors represent. The red represents pre-reproductive. That's people who are like 0 to 14 years old. Reproductive is the orange in the middle, people who are about 15 to 45. And then the yellow at the top are people who are post-reproductive. And they break it up so that you know who's going to be having children and you can help study the demography then. In these two, this shows Canada and Nigeria. And if you look here at Nigeria, it is just a perfect almost example of this, where the population is going to be growing very, very rapidly. It's got a very wide base. When these pre-reproductive children age up into reproductive age, they will start having children, and the population will just be increasing and increasing. Canada and the U.S., this is Canada, and the U.S. looks kind of similar sometimes, depending on what you look at, had a post-World War II baby boom that you can see right here. When mostly the males came back from World War II, there was, the Depression was over, there was an economic boom, and people had lots and lots of children. And so that's the baby boomers right there. But now people have started having fewer children, and we say that China and the U.S. and Europe actually have what are called graying populations, meaning that they are older. And this is a good and a bad thing. It's good in terms of slowing down population growth, but economically it can be difficult because there are less young workers to support the older folks, like I said, in terms of Social Security. And there are more healthcare costs for older people than there are for younger people. Then we turn the page and there's more about age structure diagrams. This one is kind of interesting because it actually shows the results of China's policies. This was in 1970, and you can see it's kind of a classic structure where it's a population that's going to be increasing rapidly. This was in 2019, and you can see where their one-child policy kind of kicked in. And then here, this is the projected population in 2050, and it's more stable in the lower ages, but there's this big bulge here at the top, which is going to be difficult for them to handle economically. On this page, you should know infant mortality rate, and this is just the frequency that children die in infancy. This has a huge effect on population growth. If people think that their children are going to die because of disease, bacteria infections, or or starvation, any of these things, then they will have more children, which seems counterintuitive, but they'll have more children to ensure that at least some of them survive to adulthood. And then if we turn the page to 198, there's a lot going on here. So remember, you can always pause the video and stop and write stuff down. So you need to know this idea of TFR, that's the total fertility rate, which is the number of children that a woman has. And we count it by women because, you know, men and women both, sometimes they get married and divorced, they have babies with different partners. And so it's just a lot easier if you just keep track of how many children a woman has. So for me, I have one child, so my TFR is 1. Replacement fertility, this is the TFR needed to keep the population stable. So if you want the population to stay about where it is, not get bigger, not get smaller, then you have a replacement fertility level. For developed countries like the US and countries in Europe, that's about 2.1 children per woman. And the 0.1 comes from the fact that even though we are developed countries, some children do die in infancy. And so that 0.1 takes care of, the replacement, because you want to have 2 to replace the man and woman who made the babies. So 2 to replace the 2 who made them, and the 0.1 to account for the few that die as infants. In developing countries, though, that number does need to be a lot higher due to child mortality. There are other terms throughout here that I'm not highlighting, but you definitely should know. So make sure that you always are looking at the bold terms on every page as well. This page shows the total fertility rate in different places around the world. So if you look, Europe's population is shrinking. Europe has a TFR of 1.6, which is below the replacement rate over here, which means it's shrinking. North America is also below the replacement of 2.1, but we have a lot of immigration, and so our population is actually not shrinking because of that. And then if you look up here around sub-Saharan Africa, they're rapidly growing with a TFR of about 4.6 babies per woman. All right, now we get to this chart, which is super important. This is always, always, always on the AP exam. This chart shows something called the demographic transition right here. You need to know this chart and all the stages, and I put 4 stars here because it's important. So here in the pre-industrial stage, so this is pre-industrial, the birth rate and the death rate are high because lots of babies are being born, lots of babies and lots of people are dying. Then we reach this transitional stage, and this is when medicine's getting a little bit better, technology is getting a little bit better, and so people are still having lots of babies, but the babies aren't dying. And so the death rate goes down. This line represents the death rate, but the birth rate stays high. And so when there's a big difference in here, that means that the population will increase. Then you reach the industrial stage, and people realize, hey, I don't need to have 7 babies to have 2 or 3 live. And so the birth rate starts to drop, and then the population increase is also getting smaller. And then you reach the post-industrial stage, which is when both the birth rate and the death rate are low and the population is fairly stable again. This kind of leads to an idea called population momentum, which means that it takes a generation for there to be 0% growth after hitting the post-industrial stage, because everybody that was born in here still needs to grow up and have children. And so the population is going to increase for at least a little bit longer because of this idea of population momentum. Then if we turn the page, I wrote on this one to know all terms, and it's just the ones that I just talked about, like pre-industrial and so on. Then when we get here, it asks if the demographic transition is inevitable. Up till now, we think that, most countries have gone through a demographic transition, but that's not necessarily true for developing countries that are developing right now. There is also this idea called demographic fatigue, which means that some developing nations may already be suffering too greatly from impacts of large population and climate change to actually undergo the demographic transition. And so you need to know that term, demographic fatigue. And then here it also talks about how many nations in sub-Saharan Africa really suffered from the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and it has affected Africa by creating a lot of people died, and so there's a lot of orphans, and then a lot of people, there's a loss of income and a loss of food security because so many adults have died from the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And then over here it talks about China and India and whether they will actually complete the demographic transition as well. Then when we turn the page here, this is kind of population and society. It talks a lot about family planning, birth control, contraception, which we will get into a little bit more in this chapter. And it talks about how family planning programs around the world are working. And so you should know this figure. It basically shows a woman from her first menstrual cycle to menopause. That's the reproductive window. That's about how many babies, not on average, but how many they could have if they had a baby about every year. But because of family planning and contraceptive use, women are delaying their childbearing and spacing them out. And so they may only have like 1 or 2 children that are more spaced out because they have the ability to plan their families. And then there's this science behind the story about soap operas, which is kind of interesting. And then this is always asked on the AP exam. What are some ways to reduce population growth? And the number one reason, far above anything else, is education for women. And we are talking about reading and writing and mathematics kind of education. Having girls in school, the longer they stay in school, the lower population growth that there is. And then next is to lower the infant mortality, which does seem counterintuitive, but if people, like I said before, are confident that their children will live, they will have fewer of them. And then this talks about how fertility decreases as people become wealthier. Don't be confused about the idea of fertility meaning like maybe they're not fertile. It just means fertility meaning how many children they actually have. A woman's TFR. Then over on this page, going along with this fertility decrease, equality for women and freedom always leads to lower fertility rates. And this is because education for women allows girls to marry later and earn their own money, both of which tend to lower the total fertility rate for women. And this is for a variety of reasons. In developing countries, a lot of times women have to get married because their families can't afford to feed them anymore. And so they get married to get out of the house and become, if they're not educated and they're not working, then they're just part of their husband's household. And then they start to have children, and that husband has to support all of them. If women are allowed to marry later, earn their own money, they are able to access contraception. They will delay their childbearing and have fewer children. This is an add-on to the book. But when they talk about the idea of quality of life, which is talked about a lot in terms of different countries, quality of life is basically based on the life expectancy in a country and the infant mortality rate. So those two things are what we use to talk about quality of life. Then on this actually last page in the chapter, you should know this figure and caption. It just kind of shows you the difference between material wealth, between people living in the U.S. and people living in India. How much stuff people have in the U.S. versus how much stuff people have in India, how much food people eat, how much food people waste, things like that. And you should know this figure and caption. I highlighted the term biocapacity. It used to be a term in the chapter, and now it's not anymore. Biocapacity is kind of like we have one planet Earth. And so it's this line here at one planet Earth. And this is like our overshoot. This is saying if we have an overshoot right now, then we are in ecological debt to the Earth right now. But if we could lower our population to below the amount that Earth can sustain, then we would have a reserve in terms of food and ecosystem services. There's a lot of stuff in here about population math, which we will do quite a bit of, so don't worry, I'll talk about that later in class.